The following program is a presentation of the Civil War Broadcasting Network. It is available on the free YouTube channel, General Grant by himself or Dr. E.C. Fields, and on the Facebook page, Kurt Fields is General Ulysses S. Grant, and on various other social media. The E headquarters and campsite is generalgrantbyhimself.com. This program is one of those presentations in the ongoing series General Grant Looks at the American Civil War, wherein General Grant looks at a person, place, or event in the Civil War for reflection and observation. Permission to copy and distribute is given, and indeed is encouraged. Remember, you are the future of our past. And this program is General Grant and General William Starke Rosecrans. Hello, I'm General of the Armies, Ulysses S. Grant, and I welcome you here to join me this day in my library. And on this meeting, I'm going to be thinking with you about my relationship with General William Starke Rosecrans. General Rosecrans is a very interesting man, and I have much to tell you about General Rosecrans. Well, as I think it is, Mr. Dickens said it's always good to begin at the beginning. He is born in 1818 and led a nondescript childhood. He didn't have a very good education, though. And at 13, he left home to go work as a store clerk, and he was self-taught. He was a sharp intellect, good mind, and he taught himself to read, taught himself some math, and wanted to get an education, but the only way he could get it would be a free one. So he applied for an appointment to the United States Military Academy, West Point, and he got it. So he got to West Point in 1838, the class of 42. Now, I went to the academy with Rosie, or Old Rosie as his nickname was, for 3 years. He was in a class of 42, a year ahead of me. He graduated 5th in a class of 56. Very good grades, did well in math and did well in French, which is more than I can say. I did very poorly in French. He graduated with Longstreet, Abner Doubleday, Earl Van Dorn was in his class, and Daniel Harvey Hill. So he had an interesting mix of men with whom he went to the academy, and in the case of Van Dorn specifically, men he faced across the field. He was sent his first year on the East Coast and did some engineering work, but he was so good in math that he was called back to the academy. And in 1845, he returned to the academy, and he stayed there until he resigned from the Army in 1854. Now, this would tell you that he was at the academy teaching math and some other related classes, and missed the Mexican War. He had no combat experience in the Mexican War, while so many of us who went to the academy did have a combat experience. But Rosecrans stayed there, and in 1845, he converted to Catholicism. He was a deep thinker and caught up with Catholicism. He'd gone to the Episcopalian chapel there at the academy, but he'd read a paper about Catholicism, became enamored of it, and took instruction and became a Catholic. I would remind you, this is in a time frame when Jews and Catholics are not very popular. And it was quite the bold move for Rosie, but he converted. In fact, he wrote his brother Sylvester a letter that year and told Sylvester that he had converted to Catholicism. Sylvester corresponded with him, talked with him, and Sylvester became so enamored of Catholicism, he too converted. In fact, went to Rome and studied in Rome and was brought into the priesthood in Rome. He came back to America and went to Cincinnati and was in some churches in Cincinnati and involved in the education process. And when a new diocese was opened in Columbus, Ohio, Sylvester went there, became the first Catholic bishop in Columbus, Ohio, and in fact died there. So not only was Rosie committed to Catholicism, he excited his brother, who became a very successful priest and ultimately a bishop. But Rosie, in 1854, had some failing health, and by now he's got 8 children. He met his wife when he graduated from West Point in 42, and they married in 43, and they had 8 children, and he wasn't making enough money in the Army, so he left the Army. He's one of several men that I know of who left the Army. I resigned in 1854, Henry Halleck, Kump Sherman, we all resigned in 1854, and I believe George McClellan left in 1854. But be that as it may, he left. He became a very successful businessman and held actually several patents. He held the patent for a new way to make soap, and apparently it was good soap. He also held a patent for the first round wick in a coal oil lantern. And in fact, that created a problem for him, because while he was working on this round wick, he had an accident and the lamp exploded and burned him very severely. In fact, it took him 18 months to recover, and he burned his face and scarred so badly that he grew his beard to cover the burns on his face. Also, the scar tissue, that much scar tissue, it twisted his mouth a little bit. So when it healed up, his face was in, or at least the lower part of his face, in a permanent, something of a sneer. He couldn't help it. It wasn't intentional, but that contributed greatly to his growing the beard. And he had a big nose, called it a Roman nose, and that's why he adopted the growth of a beard. He started a construction company. He built a series of locks and dams on a river in Virginia. He also was the president of a coal and coal oil company. So the man was doing very well indeed. When the war started, like myself, he went to the governor of Ohio, Governor Dennison, who he had better fortune than I. Governor Dennison appointed him as a colonel of the 23rd Ohio. It started out, he was drilling the Marion Rifles, but then the 23rd was formed, and he was appointed their colonel of volunteers. 2 fellows who were in the 23rd Ohio were William McKinley and Rutherford Hayes. And McKinley particularly was very praising of Rosie in later years. But he became the colonel, and then he went with McClellan. McClellan would see him. He wouldn't see me when I went to Ohio about the same time, trying to get a commission. McClellan avoided me. He embraced Rosecrans. But he went with McClellan into Western Virginia and fought very well in combat in Rich Mountain, the battles of Rich Mountain and the Battle of Corrick's Ford. Apparently outstanding leadership, combat leadership, and did very well. McClellan got the credit for it. Combine the successes in Western Virginia, and went against Lee, Robert E. Lee, in his first combat command. And Lee had as his subordinate John B. Floyd, whom I met almost at Dover, Tennessee, and Fort Donelson later. But John Floyd was with Robert E. Lee in Western Virginia with Lee's first combat command and defeated Lee, actually. Well, McClellan got credit for it, particularly when you combine that with the debacle at Bull Run. So McClellan's called to Washington. Well, Rosecrans is promoted to a brigadier general May the 16th of 61, brigadier general of volunteers, and he's put in command of the Department of Western Virginia, and he's got about 22,000 men. Well, he devised a plan to go after Winchester, Virginia, and he appealed to McClellan. Well, not only did McClellan turn him down, and he asked for 20,000 more men. McClellan not only didn't send him the men, he in fact took his command away because John C. Fremont had gotten an appointment. Fremont is put in command of the troops there, and Rosecrans finds himself out of a job. He doesn't have, he's a general with no command. Well, he's transferred west. So when he got west, well, he was brought down here into the the Western Theater, and was given command of the 14th Corps, which ultimately became the Army of the Mississippi, which was a short-lived army, but the Army of the Mississippi. And he was put under my command. He chafed a bit with the original Battle of Corinth, with the siege, when there really wasn't a Battle of Corinth, but he was doing a good job, and I had no difficulties with Rosecrans until the Battle of Corinth. Now, Bragg, going into the late summer of '62, Bragg was in Middle Tennessee and wanting to go up into Kentucky. And Jefferson Davis brought Sterling Price and Earl Van Dorn together in the Western Theater there, and they wanted to keep me from reinforcing or going and keeping Bragg from going into Kentucky. So they determined to attack Corinth, Mississippi, or Iuka, Mississippi. On September the 14th of '62, Price moved on Iuka. Now, Iuka is about 20 miles away from Corinth, and Burnsville, Mississippi is 5 or 6 miles north of Iuka. So you've got Corinth to the west of Iuka, and then Burnsville, and those come together in just a moment. And I had sent Rosecrans to go against and to take Price. Van Dorn is about 4 days away from joining Price in Iuka on September the 14th. Now, I had told Rosecrans to attack Price, but EOC Ord, Edward Otha Cresap Ord, is in Corinth, helping to guard the rail lines. I've got Sherman in Memphis, and Ord is in Corinth, and I've got Rosecrans on the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, east-west, between Memphis and Corinth, which is about 75 miles. So those three men are in that line: Memphis, Rosecrans, and Corinth. Iuka, if you do a crescent, Iuka is in the middle of the crescent. Rosecrans is coming up from the south, or rather, Price is coming up from the south to take Iuka and wait for Van Dorn. Van Dorn's 4 days out. I decided to have, or Rosecrans rather, suggested that Ord would come up the Mobile and Ohio Railroad from the southwest. Ord would be on the northwest side of Iuka, and when Price got to Iuka, they would clamp the two halves of the armies together and defeat Sterling Price before Van Dorn could join him. So I determined this would happen on the 18th, September 18th of 62. And it had been raining, pouring down rain, and Rosecrans was delayed from the mud. He was doing the best he could. He telegraphed me in Burnsville, Mississippi, and said he couldn't get there until the next day. He began marching at about 4:30 in the morning, which he did. Now, I was with Ord in Burnsville, just a few miles away, and we told Rosecrans that we would attack and fall in, shut the trap when we heard the battle in Iuka. But because, and Rosecrans moved about 4:30 in the afternoon, when he got near, just a couple of miles out from Iuka, he's marching on the Jacinto Road. There are two roads that were leading into Iuka, the Jacinto, and then to the east of it, the Fulton Road. I had told Rosecrans, bring men up both roads. Rosecrans opted not to. He didn't tell me. He felt that his force would be divided and he could be defeated in detail. So he didn't come up the Fulton Road, did not cover the Fulton Road, came in on the Jacinto Road. When he got to Iuka, about 4:30 in the afternoon, Sterling Price hit him with a fury, and they fought from 4:30 into the darkness. And it was such a savage fight that Sterling Price said later, I never saw any action that surpassed it in my experience in the war. Well, when it got too dark to fight, Sterling Price fell back a bit, and so did Rosecrans. The other part of the plan, with Ord coming in, did not occur because of a temperature, a cloud, acoustic shadow, I think is what it's called. The wind was blowing from the north to the south toward Iuka. Ord and I never heard the sound of the battle. We kept wondering when Rosecrans was going to do something, and Rosecrans is a few miles away fighting for his life, wondering where we are, and we didn't find out about the battle until we got messengers into the darkness. Rosecrans determined he was going to hit Price the next morning. Price had already determined the day before he was going to evacuate Corinth and go back to the south and meet Van Dorn, which he did. Now, Price's entire army marched down that Fulton Road that Rosecrans had opted not to cover, and completely got away. When daylight came, there's no Sterling Price to attack. I was not happy with that at all. And there was a Colonel David Murphy from Wisconsin who had precipitously burned some supplies, and Rosecrans wanted to sack him, and I said, no, don't do that. He's a civilian, he's a volunteer. He just panicked. It was the same David Murphy when at the Battle of Holly Springs later that December surrendered Holly Springs without a fight. I should have let Rosecrans sack David Murphy of Wisconsin. Well, Price fell back, and the good and the bad, the yin and the yang of that is that Price was not able to join with Van Dorn, and they link up with Bragg and invade Kentucky. Now, this is about the same time, well, I have to discuss that later. We kept Bragg rather Price and Van Dorn from joining Bragg. However, Rosecrans didn't cover the Fulton Road. Price got away, and we couldn't destroy the army that Price had. So there was some give and some take. I was not happy with that, with Rosecrans over that. Now Rosecrans later went into and occupied with Ord Corinth, and I had warned them to be sure that you're prepared for whatever may come, and they were, but not like I wanted them to. Van Dorn attacked Corinth on October the 3rd, and it was a savage fight. They got into the works, but were fought back. Now, Ord did well, and Rosecrans did well, but the fighting went all day. The next day, the Confederates hit again. They did get into Corinth, and the fighting was again savage, but they were able, by the hardest, to prevail and pushed Van Dorn back. I wanted Rosecrans to pursue Van Dorn immediately. He didn't. He said the men were tired and they needed to be prepared. And I said about that men carrying only what they had on their person would have been much more valuable in pursuit of Van Dorn than a well-armed and equipped man the next day. Van Dorn got away. He went north toward Pittsburgh Landing and got to the Hatchie River, Davis Bridge. Ord caught up with him there. They fought about a 4-hour battle on the Hatchie River, on the Battle of Davis Bridge, but Van Dorn was able to get away and learn to fight, or able to fight, another day. Well, about this time, Buell, who's been laggard in pursuing Bragg up in Middle Tennessee, is relieved of command from the Army of the Cumberland, and Rosecrans is sent up there to take command. Well, he got to Murfreesboro, Tennessee, which is 25-30 miles southeast of Nashville, and took command of the Army of the Cumberland. And as far as Halleck in Washington City could see, and Secretary Stanton and President Lincoln could see, that Rosecrans wasn't doing anything. You know, he just seemed to be in a stall. Now Rosecrans, when challenged about it, said he had to take a raw army and train them and equip them and arm them properly. And he was right on all three counts, but he could have moved with more alacrity than what he did. And Bragg is rumbling about going into Kentucky. The president is greatly in fear that he's going to do just that. And Stanton as well. Stanton is telling Halleck to twist Rosecrans' tail and get him to move against Bragg. Well, Bragg finally attacks Rosecrans on December 31st of 62. They fought all day December 31st in some of the most savage fighting of the war. The 1st of January was a quiet day, and on January 2nd of 63, they went at it again. Again, some of the most savage fighting of the war. In fact, I believe that the Battle of Stones River is, when one considers the number of troops involved in the opposing forces, that it is the bloodiest battle of the war. And after that battle, Bragg fell back to Tullahoma, and which is not far from Murfreesboro, where the Battle of Stones River was fought, and goes into camp licking his wounds, and so did Rosecrans. And Rosecrans stayed there for 6 months. Now, by this time, at the end of about a 6-month period, getting into June, I'm in Vicksburg holding a siege with Pemberton there, and I'm wanting reinforcements. Jefferson Davis is in Richmond, and he's wanting for Bragg to move or send reinforcements to Pemberton or Joe Johnston in Jackson, Mississippi, to help Pemberton, who's bottled up under siege in Vicksburg. Neither army is moving. And President Lincoln gets the Secretary of War Stanton to wire Halleck, and Halleck wired Rosecrans and said, "You've got to move." And Rosecrans said, "Well, I'm preparing," and so forth. Finally, after several of these messages, Halleck says, "If you don't move against Bragg, I'm going to be forced to relieve you of command and put somebody else in who will, if you don't move immediately." Well, Rosecrans replied back that if you mean by immediately tonight, no. If you mean, by in a few days, then yes, I'll move. So the campaign became known as the Tullahoma Campaign, went from June the 24th to July 3rd. So on the 24th of June, Rosecrans moves out southeast to go against Bragg. Well, it was a relatively bloodless campaign. It went from June 24th to July 3rd. And through some brilliant maneuvering, in fact, the Tullahoma Campaign is termed or considered to be, if not the best run campaign in the war. It's one of the best run and most effective campaigns in the war. And through maneuvering, Rosecrans jackknifed and moved about and forced Bragg out of Shelbyville, out of Tullahoma, and pushed him down toward Chattanooga. Bragg kept falling back with this relentless pressure from Rosecrans and went into camp in Chattanooga. The campaign was essentially over. Bragg moved out and went to Chattanooga on July the 4th. So the campaign went from June the 24th of 63 to July 3rd. It was so well done that there were some quotes. People said these things about the campaign. President Lincoln wrote, "The flanking of Bragg at Shelbyville, Tullahoma, and Chattanooga is the most splendid piece of strategy I know of." And the Union cavalry commander, David Stanley, said this, "If any student of the military art desires to make a study of a model campaign, let him take his maps and General Rosecrans' orders for the daily movements of his campaign. No better example of successful strategy was carried out during the war than in the Tullahoma campaign." Secretary of War Stanton telegraphed Rosecrans and said, "Lee's army is overthrown, July 3rd, Grant victorious, that happened on July the 4th. You and your noble army now have a chance to give the finishing blow to the rebellion. Will you neglect the chance?" Now, this didn't sit well with Rosie. And he said, "Just received your cheering telegram announcing the fall of Vicksburg and confirming the defeat of Lee. You do not appear to observe the fact that this noble army has driven the rebels from Middle Tennessee. I beg in behalf of this army that the War Department may not overlook so great an event because it is not written in letters of blood." Because it ended, when you think about Gettysburg on July 3rd with Pickett's charge, and then Vicksburg falling with a whisper instead of a battle, and then Middle Tennessee falling, in essence, when Bragg moved back into Chattanooga, the eyes of the country were not drawn to the end of a brilliant campaign and bloodless, relatively, that Rosecrans had done. Rosecrans was chagrined. So I would also like to add here what was said about the Second Battle of Corinth, which was October 3rd and 4th, October 3rd and 4th. It's called the Second Battle because of Halleck having taken it back in May or early June of 62. And this was said by one of the troops, or rather correspondents, Whitelaw Reid, in his book Ohio and the War, said this about Corinth. It lives in the memory of every soldier who fought that day, how his general plunged into the thickest of the conflict, fought like a private soldier, dealt sturdy blows with the flat of his sword on the runaways, and fairly drove them to stand. Then came a quick rally, which his magnificent bearing inspired. A storm of grape from the batteries tore its way through the rebel ranks. Reinforcements which Rosecrans sent flying gave impetus to the national advance, and the charging column was speedily swept back outside the entrenchments. That's the second day, the end of the second day at Corinth on October 4th. I wrote this: 2 or 3 hours of pursuit on the day of the battle without anything except what the men carried on their persons would have been worth more than any pursuit commenced the next day could possibly have been. So, a reflection back on the Second Battle of Corinth on October 3rd and 4th. I wasn't happy that he didn't pursue, as I said earlier, and Whitelaw Reid had a very high opinion of what General Rosecrans did during the Battle of Corinth. But back to Chattanooga. So Bragg, at the end of June and early July, is encamped in Chattanooga, around Chattanooga. Rosecrans moved on him, and Bragg fell back across the state line into North Georgia and the mountains there. Now, 2 things had happened with reinforcements. Longstreet had been sent down with 2 divisions to join Bragg. That's interesting because Davis wanted Lee to go. Lee declined. He sent Longstreet. So his old warhorse is not with him in Virginia. And Longstreet does the greatest military movement in history to that date on trains and got down there in, I think, 12 days. Well, when he got there, it wasn't a joyful day for him because he couldn't abide Bragg. He hated Bragg. Bragg hated him. Nevertheless, Longstreet is there to help Bragg. The only time a force from the Army of Northern Virginia came west to fight with the Western Army. On the Federal side, Joe Hooker is sent down with about as many men, maybe a little more, from the Army of the Potomac, which is the only time in the war that the Army of the Potomac sent a force down to fight with an army in the West. But Bragg had fallen back into North Georgia, and Rosecrans had 3 corps or 3 divisions of his troops going into North Georgia, and they were not in supporting distance of each other. And he thinks that Bragg is still on the retreat from him. At this time, though, Bragg is not moving back from Rosecrans. He's waiting to get him right where he wants him, which he did. Rosecrans unwittingly went into Bragg's trap. And on September the 19th, Bragg slammed shut the trap jaws. And the bloodiest battle in the Western theater was fought for the next 2 days, September 19th and 20th of 1863. And Chickamauga, I understand, is River of Death, and that's exactly what it was. And the men who fought in that battle are a who's who listing of stellar command for the Confederacy and, for the most part, for the Federal side. And they fought for 2 days. Now, one incident I should like to mention is that General Thomas Wood, on the 20th, Rosecrans, who was a very profane man and smoked cigars one after the other, was stressed in the battle, and he found that Thomas Wood had not moved quickly enough to suit Rosecrans. So he rode out to Wood's camp and cursed him savagely and shouted at him. And he did this in front of Wood's staff and his soldiers. And then he thunders away. And I cannot repeat, will not repeat, all that I understand that Rosecrans shouted at General Wood. And then in the lineup of the battle, Thomas has got one end of the line, George Thomas, and then there's General Reynolds. And in the confusion of the battle, one of the officers on the Federal side perceived that there was a gap in the line. And he tells Rosecrans, and Rosecrans sent a staff officer out to tell General Wood, move to your right immediately. What had happened was there were troops in the tall grass and the trees that could not be seen. They were there. There was no gap. But General Wood, who'd just been cursed heatedly and in front of his troops, knew this. But he said, all right, I'm moving. The staff officer that brought him the message said, but don't you see, I have been ordered to move, and I will so move right now. And he pulled his corps, I believe, over to the right to get next to and fight with George Thomas. Thomas intercepted him and said, I don't need you here, I need you in another place. And he said, will you assume the responsibility of changing my orders? And Thomas said, yes, of course I will. And only then did Wood move where George Thomas told him to go. But when Wood moved over, he opened up a really wide open area in Rosecrans' lines. And on the Confederate side of that gap was none other than James Longstreet. And Longstreet poured thousands into that gap. And when they got into the gap, he turned and went sideways and very nearly won the battle there. Rosecrans was stunned, and James Garfield was his chief of staff. Rosecrans is trying to save the army by now, and he sent Garfield to George Thomas and to ask him, told him, hold at all costs. And Rosecrans retreated back into Chattanooga. It would have been better if he had gone to George Thomas himself, but he sent Garfield. Garfield told Thomas the situation, gave him his orders, and Thomas said, I'll do it. And Thomas, with his men armed with 7-shot repeaters, did indeed hold under the most heated of attacks. It was a monumental feat on the part of George Thomas and his troops. And George Thomas earned the title of Rock of Chickamauga because he kept the entire army from being destroyed. And when it was possible, he pulled back in. They went into siege in Chattanooga, and this is September 20th. I was sent up there, got there on the 23rd. On the 21st, in Stevenson, Alabama, as I recall, I met Rosecrans on his way out because I had relieved Rosecrans and appointed Thomas as commanding officer. I relieved Rosecrans, and I ran into Rosecrans on his way out, interviewed him for an hour or so and asked him what he thought of the situation, told me what he thought I should do, and it was exactly what I had already planned to do, and I just marveled why he didn't do himself what he suggested that I do. He went back home then for a while and was assigned duty in Missouri, just desultory duty. He did, however, stop Sterling Price, met Price again when in '64 when Price was going into Missouri, and Rosecrans stopped him. Rosecrans then, let me see, thinking about, he stayed with, well, in '64 though, as well as stopping Price, he was offered the vice presidency to run with Abraham Lincoln. Yet another case when one thinks Rosecrans could have been the president. But he replied that he would accept it, but Lincoln never got the letter. It's felt that Secretary of War Stanton stopped the letter from getting to President Lincoln. But Rosecrans, William Starke Rosecrans, was offered by Lincoln the vice president's place on that ticket, and had he had his letter received, he would have been the president of the United States. But Rosecrans stayed in the Army until he was mustered out in January of '66. He was later breveted Brigadier General, Regular Army, and to go forward in 1889, he was placed on made a Brigadier General and placed on the active retired list. In '68 and '69, President Johnson sent him as minister ambassador to Mexico, and he served there 2 years until I took office, and then I replaced him. He went to California to seek his fortune, and in the next few years, he got the nickname of the Great Decliner, because he declined the Democratic nomination to run for the governor of California, and then the governor of Nevada, and then as a congressman, I think, from Utah. But he was offered 2 gubernatorial races and a congressman, turned down all 3, said his business was doing too well, and got, I don't think it was a friendly term, but became known as the Great Decliner. In 1881, from California, he ran for Congress, and he served from 1881 to 1885. And it is singular, I think, that when the bill was being put through Congress in 1885 to restore me to the active retired list so that Julia could get a pension, Rosecrans was one of the few congressmen that voted against it. So he got, I suspect he might feel like the last lick, because he voted against my getting a pension in 1885 when I desperately needed it. He later went on, he died in 1898 and was buried in California, and then he was later disinterred and reinterred in Arlington National Cemetery, where he now rests. And that is the story of my relationship with General William Starke Rosecrans, and how we worked together and did not work together. I should also like to add here, as I'm thinking about it at the end of our conversation, his grandfather, his mother's father, Mary Hopkins was his mother, but his grandfather was a Revolutionary War soldier and was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. But I feel like, for the moment, I have said quite enough and related all I should like at this time to say about General Grant and William Starke Rosecrans. I'm glad you've seen fit to join me this day in my library, and hope that you will see fit to join me in the future here in the library and in the parlor when I reflect about a person, place, or event in the war or after the war, and share my thoughts with you. But at this moment, I am General of the Army's Ulysses S. Grant, thanking you for joining me and bidding you a fond adieu.